Well, good evening, and thank you, Jenny and Julie. We're very short notice for inviting us. For those of you who don't know us, although it's already been, we've been introduced, I'm Lawrie Tonbridge, and this is my sister, who's a little older than me, Barbara. I was born in Stock, in St John's Hospital, actually, in August, I've got to say, it's 1937. And my sister was born actually in Stock a little earlier than that, as I said. The theme is childhood memories. And as myself and my sister did a lot, she'd had more memories of the village than I do. In fact, I'm quite impressed because lots of things she's got down here, even I didn't know. And I did just sort of think that in this modern technology-driven world, there seems to be a strong desire by many people to embrace some of the more peaceful aspects of village life. And I think that's something Barbara and I do endorse very much now. Apart from my 2 years national service in the RAF and some 7 or 8 years living in Hydes Park, in the 60s I've lived all my life in Stock and couldn't wait to return here in 1970. It's a bit scary to think that we are now one of the oldest families living in the village. I can think of the Keelings, and I'm sure Barbara will probably think one or two others. But our history as a family in Stock goes back to 1906, when grandfather bought the old leather bottle inn in a leather bottle and some surrounding properties. And our late mother, Ida Tonbridge, God bless her, who many of you will remember with great affection, I think, was born in Stock in 1911, as was her 93-year-old brother Ralph, who's still alive and lives in Wimborne, Dorset. Our late father came from Little Waltham and was the youngest of a family of 13. I think it was 8 boys and 5 girls, or it might be the other way around. And I always remember him saying he was, the eldest son was married before he was born, which struck me as being most amazing. And father was 6 months younger than mother, and she often used to jokingly refer to him as her toy boy. I'm not sure she knew what it meant, but she found it amusing. I think now I'd like perhaps to hand over to Barbara, because I've got memories here that I can go back. But as I say, I'd like to give my sister a chance, and I probably won't get another word in, but I've just got to...
Well, hello everybody. I was born in 1932 in December, and I was born in the Glen, which was the old leather bottle pub. It wasn't a pub when I was born. My grandfather had converted it to a house, and it was called the Glen. And I was born in the tap room. It was. It was a farming community, and it was dairy and crops and fruit and poultry. And my grandfather had been the carrier, but when the buses came, he became a market gardener. And Laurie's told you that he bought the Glen. It's the low-profile thatched Grade 2 listed building at the bottom of Leather Bottom Hill. It had no facilities at all. We had the water came from a well, we had to pump it, and we had water butts, and we kept the water from the well outside the rear doors. And we had no lighting, no electricity, so we had lamps and candles, which I loved. And the cooking was done on a kitchener, and we had a nurse closet out of doors, which was discreetly hidden in bushes, and we had to go out there as it got dusk. And of course we had chamber pots under the bed. We had a galvanised bath that we had before the fire. No, of course there was no drainage, and every day we had cooked breakfast, and we all sat at the table, and there was no television or anything like this. Always sat at the table for our meals. My grandfather used to work in the garden all day, and he'd be called in for a coffee break, a cocoa break actually, and then we had lunch. Then we had a siesta in the afternoon. He used to read the paper by the kitchen, and I used to lay on an ottoman with my gran, and we used to rest the afternoon. We had tea at 4 o'clock, and we had supper. And there was always salt, pepper, and everything on the table. When you think people are told not to eat salt, we ate plenty of salt, all these things. And I had jobs. I lived there until I was 4, and I used to help to feed the chickens, the orchard, had lots of fruit trees, it was beautiful, and he had lots of cherry trees. He sold cherries, well, masses of cherries. It was absolutely gorgeous. And I used to help him with the chickens. I used to go into there was a corn and hopper room, and I used to get corn with him and the mash. And they were free range, of course, in those days. And I used to collect the eggs, and I used to go gleaning to Steele's farm and Siemens Lane corn with him. I was always out with him. And he took me on long walks to White Lilies or to Siemens Lane, and we've got a tree in Siemens Lane down by Blue Hedges that we call Granddad's tree. And we still walk to it, and it's still there. Yes, a very old tree. And I used to grind salt for Gran. We used to have the salt come in blocks because she was always cooking. And I used to grind it, and I used to stir the cocoa. I had lots of little jobs, polish brass. And Gran cooked and cleaned all day. It was just very ordinary, really. And as it was thatched, it had to be thatched every 7 years. And I remember seeing it thatched one year. It was very interesting. Because thatchers are quite rare now. But it was straw thatched, so that's why it had to be done every 7 years. Norfolk reed, of course, lasts forever, but I don't think it looks quite so nice. Then there was a worldwide slump at this time, and we were on the verge of one now. And I was born in that, but completely unaware of that, because we were pretty self-sufficient. Grandad grew all the vegetables and fruit that we needed. We had delivery people. Now, the delivery people that came, we had milk which came by horse and cart, and Lawrie can tell you because he used to go around with Agnes. I think her daughter's here tonight. You're very in love with Agnes. Agnes is lovely. She was lovely, absolutely lovely. And she used to come around with her horse and cart, churns. And the milk was measured into jugs, and it was still measured into jugs when Fred Makings took over the round and went round in his van. But Lawrie might tell you about Agnes.
She had this lovely horse and track cart. It used to come down Well Lane, and it was, I suppose it was quite common in those days, but she never spoke of it. It was on the top of Well Lane, and it would just walk on to the next stop. He never said anything to it. It would just stop, and it would walk on another 50 yards, stop. That was incredible. I knew just where it had to stop, and we just delivered the milk, and then it would go on.
That was Agnes Stride.
Agnes Stride, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Very pretty. She's not older than me.
She was,
I remember I was only 12 or 13.
Lovely, yes.
She was wonderful.
She was. Yeah. She was always rosy cheeked, and
yeah.
She used to like Annie get your gun, really. She was in control of the whole thing.
We used to go around to Ginjoy's, which is where the Fosters lived. The Fosters, very nice family, and my Aunt Marge used to work in the kitchen there, which is where the horse pulled up. And every morning I went with the milk, I'd go up to the door, and she'd open the door, and there was this beautiful smell of toast came out of the kitchen. And I always wanted to ask her for a piece of toast, I never got one. Years later, when I mentioned it to her, she said, "Oh, you could have asked her for some." Childhood memories.
Yes. We had an oil man that came round. That was important because we'd got the oil lamps, and he sold soap and all sorts of things, blue bags and methylated spirits, and a lovely smelling van that was. And he was Monkey Madel, and he lived in the thatched house at the bottom of White's Hill, which is the oldest house in the village. And it was all the thatch was always covered up, wasn't it, with tin. We had bakers, Cotties the bakers, they also delivered the bread. We had the butcher, Fred Baker, and we had Wrights the butchers, and the meat was delivered, and the boy came on a bicycle with a basket, and the tray of meat was brought to the door. We had a hardware store. Some people might remember Mr. Upson's shop. It was a bicycle shop as well, because there was not much traffic in those days. We mostly had bicycles or we walked. Mrs. Brown kept the accumulator shop, which was right on the corner of the square. There is a house now where the blacksmith stood, and that was Mr. Brown, who also owned the bear. and his son Alf, who used to help him. The blacksmith shop was really the centre of our village, and it was so lovely because you saw the big cart horses in there, and the forge and the bellows. And when we had buses, they came round into the square. They didn't go along that bit from the Cock to the post office. They all came into the square, the double-decker buses, and they stopped at the blacksmith's and they stopped at the Bear. And then they went, because that was the route of the stagecoaches, because they stopped off at the inns, so they kept to that route. And that was the blacksmith's was really very good. We used to love to stand there and watch. The post office sold sweets and medication, and that was the house with a bay window opposite the war memorial, and it was kept by Mrs. Barker. And it was also the sorting room, and Pedlar Palmer used to come up from Ingatstone with all the mail, and he used to they used to sort it underneath. We lived in the flat above the post office for a few months.
Not us, that was you and Ron.
Ron and my husband and I. And we used to hear them sorting the mail down below. I remember Pedlar Palmer saying that when they had the life science research, he always recognised a blue packet, because if the wind was in the right direction, people used to send dead ducks and all sorts to see why they died in a blue packet for the life science. And he'd come over the little bridging, so he said the smell was so bad. By then it was decomposed. And he was lovely, Pedlar Palmer. He was always smiling, lovely, wasn't he? And he brought the mail up to the village. Yes, we had bakers, butchers, the accumulator shop. And then we had Tuffields, where the post office is now. That was a grocery shop. On one side it was a long wooden counter, they sold groceries. On the other side it was haberdashery. The vintners was Watson's, and they were grocery. Mrs. Deering was next to the old village hall in Mill Road, and it became the stock pot. It's now flats, I believe, isn't it? Yes. Mrs. Ours had a little shop which faced the school. It was where Hagen's was. That's her grandson. And that was a sweet shop, wasn't it? You knew more about that than me. And Mrs. Mrs. Eves kept a little shop opposite the, well, it was the antique shop, but I don't know what it is now, because that was a butcher's then. It was Wright's the Butcher's, but it's been many things, I think. And she kept a little shop in the end cottage, in that row of cottages, Mrs. Eves. So the shoemaker came later, Mr. Bosco, and I think Lawrie will tell us more about him. And I think and we had a garage and a monkey puzzle tree, which I'm surprised they didn't put preservation order on the monkey puzzle tree, because it really was a lovely tree. At the crossroads, Well Lane, Mill Road.
They did put a preservation order on it.
They did?
But they managed to get round it by saying it was soaked, the roots were soaked in petrol.
Oh.
Including also the hedge, on which a preservation order was. I just saw an order.
Well, in that case, I wish they'd planted another, because I did when I had to take my silver birch down. And I think it's a pity we haven't got one.
They wanted it out of the way of the book.
Yes, yes. Well, Mr. Sargent and Mrs. Sargent worked very hard at the garage, and they also had a taxi business. So really the village was pretty well self-contained. And
that reminds me, I remember at school they said, how did the Israelites cross the Red Sea? And they said, Mr. Sargent.
well, that was we had Reverend Austin. It was a Church of England school. Reverend Austin came down on Fridays to test us, because we had to learn lots of Bible by heart. And Bert Weston, who lived in the shop on the corner, Vintners, which was then Watson's, he got the cane every Friday. It was dreadful, he didn't seem to mind, and he stuttered quite a lot. He stuttered. And this Reverend Austin used to ask questions, and he said how that's when he said, how did the Israelites get across the Red Sea? And that's what Bert said in Mr. Sargent's taxi. And I know that in playtime, he never came out on Friday because he oversleep. And the canes stood in the corner of the classroom, and they were different thicknesses, but he got it every Friday because he was so cheeky, he couldn't help it.
I just think my earliest memory was sitting in a field around the back of Goatsmoor Lane, playing with mud, while Mother picked potatoes all day. And I was with another little boy, I think it was little boy Dennis Wright, and we just played all day with mud. We used to try and bury potatoes while they were picking them because they were fill up. And I also remember a V2 rocket coming over stock. I was on my own at home, and I remember this thing fizzing, it suddenly stopped, and it came down in Glerky, and I think it caused quite a lot of damage. Again, these are all childhood memories. Behind Dakin Drive there was this wonderful hill, very steep hill, and when it snowed, we prayed for snow every winter. We used to go to Boggling, and it was quite a long hill. Do you remember? Yeah. And there was a little tiny gap in the hedge at the bottom, and you had to make that head gap, because you didn't, I mean it was a dreadful hedge, and I didn't on a couple of occasions, there was one like that. She was quite dead.
Michael Maidens had a really super.
We did.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, we passed them.
That's right. And I was on that really once, and we went down straight through that.
Yeah.
But you went through the sewer.
It was a lovely
Yeah.
yeah.
Went straight through the stick.
It's wonderful sledge, and I only got it on it once, and I managed to jump on it first. The trouble is, as you were going down, about 6 people jumped on top of it. And, it's never sunk up, and I never jumped on it again.
And they had car seats on it, and used to throw us up in the air.
Well, the springs in it, it's so fancy.
And obviously the Cogs Bar was at Mrs. Owl's. That was my favourite shop because she sold sweets, cigarettes, which I didn't buy till I was 9. And it took me 30 years to get over it. Ice cream and soft drinks, and I remember taking my ration book up there, and she used to cut out this little huge wonderful little bowl of sweets. Happy memories. And sometimes on Sunday afternoons, it's much amazing, but we meet on the corner of the Cock Inn, and we were bored, so we used to take our coats off and put them down in the road as goalposts, 2 at each end, and we'd play football, and when the car started looking up the hill, we'd just take them up and let them go and just carry on playing football. I wouldn't like to try that now. I remember being chased. I used to work at a farm during school holidays, called Scrivener's Farm, which is down the bottom of Well Lane. Lovely old family called the Warrens used to live there, and I was collecting these eggs one afternoon when this raging bull came for me. And luckily I was by a big hen house, so I dived and I got into the hen house, and the thing came snorting up, it was a huge great thing, and it got fed up and went off. But I remember Rob Warren, he was a big ex-boxer, he hurled this pitchfork into its backside, and it disappeared up the top of this field, and they called the vet and had to shoot it. But that was a really scary moment, moments you never forget. I also remember the fair. We had a fair which came to stop. It used to be where the new school is. This wonderful fair every summer, yes. And I know Agnes was lovely, but this was my first club. I must have been about 12. And there was a beautiful girl called Rosie. And she had this, she always came with the fair, and she had this wonderful golden earring, which I thought was, and I remember going home and saying to Mother, I want one of those, and she was like, I'm not having one of those. I was disappointed at the time, but I'm glad she didn't allow it. Something more serious, I remember being confirmed at Stock Church when I was 13. I'll never forget the wonderful feeling I had when I served at the altar with Father Tatham. I don't know whether you would have known Father Tatham, but a wonderful man. And I always sort of felt very special. I had to close the altar gates and then put the mat down so that people could take confirmation. And he always gave me Mass first, and then came down to the others, and I stood there just with him. The altar side of the gates being really wonderful. It was a wonderful moment, and we had an organist called Mr. Bug, and he was very keen, I would say, was he, on his organ playing, and the organ was in the centre of the church. You couldn't see, you could see him, but you couldn't see the person. It was a pump. We had to use a pump to pump it, and it had a little weight. And you could watch this weight, and if you stopped pumping, the little weight would go up. And I used to get bored, so I used to wait until it got to the very top, and And he always sensed there was an impending disaster because he used to put his head like, pound, pound, away. And I did this on several occasions, and I would stop actually pumping the organ after that. He did tell me off one day, so I and a few friends rolled some massive snowballs up where his little Austin 7 was parked outside, and we had these massive 5-foot snowballs, 4 of them all around his car, after choir practice. I'm glad I can get this off my chest after. And we put ice in his locks. And I don't know if he's still there, but the Austin 7 isn't there, he must have got away. But Mr. Bug, if you're around, sorry. Poor man. I think one of my happiest memories was when I did my national service after 8 weeks, where actually we were allowed home. And we had to come home in our full RAF uniform. And I came home and I wanted to change immediately. Obviously, I've got 8 weeks in this thing. I travelled all the way from Liverpool or somewhere. And I said to my mum, I said, change. And she said, no, no. Granddad was at home and he was very ill. He was in his 90s. He was upstairs. She said, no, just go up and let him see you, because he was he was very smart, wasn't he? I mean, his boots always shone. He always used to say to us, what was that thing he said about us?
He used to say, always say about shine boots. He said, if you can't shine one in, shine the
Yeah,
other.
so that's for me. If you can't shine one in, boy, always shine the other. Yeah. And then I went up to see him, and I remember him turning over and seeing me, and sort of looking me up and down, and a look in his face. I'm sure there were tears in his eyes. And he said, oh, you look very smart, grandson, or Lawrie, whatever. And he died 3 weeks later, and I thought, it's lovely, to have that memory. So I'm always so pleased that I did that. You mentioned buckets from the well, and I used to love Grandad and Gran, who lived down at the level, but I didn't like to go down there very often because they always gave me jobs. And the job I usually got, we had a series of big pieces of tin, corrugated tin, that was spread all around the orchard and connected with a series of ropes
To the cherry tree.
to the cherry trees. And I used to have to stand at somewhere near the thing and pull this thing, which seemed like hours. It was only probably 10 minutes, but I used to hate it. So I was reluctant to go down there. And but he used to reward me after 10 hours, or half an hour probably, by taking me into the orchard. And he took me up to one of the trees, and there was an apple, and he gave me a rotten apple. He cut the half pin out, so best apples you can get, Lawrie. I never got a new one. There was all these lovely apples. Never had one of those. And when they first had a television, my mother's brother Ralph, who's the one who's still alive and lives in Poole, they had an aerial, the very first TV aerial, remember the old H aerials? And Ralph had a very good sense of humour, and he asked Grandad if he could fix it to his chimney, flat chimney, and Grandad said yes. I think it was
I
quite.
thought they said that was very good.
He thought it was, yeah, that's very good of him. He thought he was fixing it to my chimney. Anyway, Ralph got this H aerial up, and he said to Grandad, just sit outside, and he got me a chair out in the garden, just sit there, because eventually, in that top half, there'll be a picture. And Grandad sat, he said, I can't see the picture, Ralph. He said, birds are getting the cherries, and I'm sitting there. Eventually, I think we must have troubled him.
Pre-war, there were big houses, the bigger houses, the larger houses in stock, had gardeners, chauffeurs, grooms, maids, cooks and nannies, and we had Major Moore living at the plantation. We had Admiral Sir Vernon Haggard living at Little Court, Major Gibbon Mill Road, Major Mackey the Elms, Colonel Brazier Cray at Stock Lodge. We had Lord Perry at Ford Motors at Lilystone Hall. We had the Dunstervilles at Lush Hill, and we had, I think, the Langs lived at Apps Farm before Lionel Lister, who I knew. We had the Tetley Joneses in Cobblers, and we used to call them the Tetley Teas, and they probably were. And we had we had Mr. Ellis in Greenwoods, and he was a church warden. The Essex Hunt met regularly and with dogs, and they were everywhere, and we saw the hunt quite regularly, met in the village, and I know that they went down the road. I'd seen them all around the gardens. And then when the war broke out, of course, all the chauffeurs and all the gardeners and the grooms had to go to war, and they were taken prisoner of war almost at once, and they were put into the Stalag prison. And they were there for 6.5 years. And Jane, my best friend at school, she lived in the plantation cottage. And her father had been a groom at the plantation for Major Moore. She was evacuated to Shropshire by Colonel Todhunter. He arranged it. So I didn't see her again until the war was over. Then the evacuees came to Stock, and there were 50 of them. They were Roman Catholic, and they came, I know ours, Barbara Ann, came from Edmonton, so it was that area. And she stayed with us, and I think church unity began then, because I used to go to Mass with her to the Roman Catholic Church, and I was given a rosary, and I was given lovely pictures, and I sat with the sisters, and I still remember their names. They were lovely, they were very kind. We had Sister Mary Allcott, Sister Thomas Moore, Sister Mary Carmel, and the Reverend Mother. And so I went there, and I also used to go to the chapel, to Pilates with Elsie Cooper, and we had Mr. Goodchild at the chapel. And I was in the choir at Stock Church, and previously Mrs. Austin had taken it. She was a very severe person. Reverend Austin was a descendant of Jane Austen, and Mrs. Austen was an Allen of Allen and Hanbury. And I think when I was at Hyman's house, it's either the Allens or the Hanburys that lived at Hyman's house. But she was a very wealthy lady, yes, she was. But she was Allen, an Allen of Allen and Hanbury's. But she was very strict. And I remember the landmine falling in the churchyard. It shook my bedroom windows. And we went over to see the crater, which was huge. And she had always taken Sunday school and choir practice in the old rectory. The old rectory was always open to us. We always just went in. And if you went to choir practice, if you were on your own, you had to sing in the parlour at a harmonium. She'd give you you had a cup of bovril, hot bovril, and a piece of bread to warm up your voice, and then you had to sing. And I know when the landmine fell, the Austins very soon after that moved to Yorkshire, but before she went, she arranged for us to have an outing to Whipsnade Zoo and to the Dunstable Downs, and we had a huge hamper which I think must have come from Fortnum and Mason's. It was full of the most gorgeous cakes, everything. We'd never had anything like that. We'd never been anywhere because you couldn't go out as a village. I mean, the coast was all fenced off with barbed wire, and we were really confined to the village for the war. We didn't go out of it, but we didn't need to because we played. We had a spinney to play behind our house. We could climb trees and bail out, hopscotch in the road, and lots of children we had to play with, and it was just good fun. But then, of course, when the war came, we had gas masks allocated, gas mask drill at school, identity discs to wear with our number on our wrist. We had to go to the rectory hall for injections for diphtheria. The sandbags were put into school windows so you couldn't see out. And we had mesh stuck all over our windows at home. And you had to black out every night. You couldn't show any light at all. And we would have talks at school on what not to touch. We had national savings stamps, and life really did change. And at 9 years old, I was knitting for servicemen at school. We knitted scarves and balaclavas. We couldn't turn heels in socks, but we had to knit as far as we could with the socks. And they were such dull colours. We hated it. And I used to stretch my scarf because they were measured. And I used to know that navy blue, khaki, and Air Force blue, just those colours. And we dressed really in drab colours. And of course there were clothing coupons, so you couldn't really have many clothes really. And shoes, you had coupons for those. So we used to go to Mr. Upson, and he put Blakey's in our shoes. We used to kick sparks. We used to like But they're Blakey's are a little stud.
Steel.
Stud. And they're used to make your shoes last, really, so they didn't wear out.
That's when they went through your shoe and they really stuck.
Well, they hurt, yes, exactly. But we didn't really have an awful lot of anything. But we enjoyed our lives. We had a lot of fun. And the evacuees also knew about tadpoles and newts, and we used to go off down the lane, Well Lane, with our jars, and we'd go right down to Brambletine, and the ponds were on the verge beside the road. They're not fenced off, they're hedged off now. The one right up at Brambletine, I'm not sure what it's called. But we just used to go and get our tadpoles from there, and then we came down to near Mr. Harnet's and we used to get our newts from there. They had the newts there, not many, but we'd catch one. And then we came along to just opposite Marigold Lane as a footpath, and we used to go along with a stream ran along. We caught freshwater shrimps. And then we did trespass on the corner because we had to go into the field to get our water snails, freshwater snails, so it's obviously spring running through there, and our pondweed. And when we got home with the evacuees and all our friends, we used to have a log pile in the garden because it was all open fires, and we used to put all our jars in the shade and let them hatch out into frogs and things. And we had a swing in the garden, and the convent was moved to next door but one to us, so the sisters and the evacuees used to be next door to one, and we had a garden full of children all queuing up for swings. And I remember one of the evacuees coming round one morning with she had a saucer and she had cornflakes on it and a slow worm to give them breakfast. But we had a really lovely time with the evacuees.
I do remember when I used to play cricket and football to start, they used to always meet in the Cock every Monday night to decide who was going to play in the cricket and football teams for the following Saturday. And we all used to rush up to the old post office, as it was, and see if our name was on the list. I remember we used to all congregate there, and we were so disappointed if our name didn't appear or it was reserved. But something I wanted to tell you, or want to say to you, you're actually being addressed by a criminal, so those of you who wish to go, George Keeble, I think we've mentioned, he was the village policeman, and he was a rather stern policeman, and we had our own policeman in the village, and he lived next to where the garage was. And he had this big bicycle with these great big wheels, and he used to trundle around the village because he was far too quick for him, and he used to chase us for all sorts of reasons. And this particular evening, there were 5 of us, I think, that he chased, and we all shot off in different directions. And I remember I hid in a ditch, I put my bicycle around behind his hedge, he came trundling past, and I thought, oh, we've beaten him again. Anyway, the next day, I was in the front room, who should be coming up the drive in Well Lane, but George in full dress. Oh dear, what's it? And because he knew Mother very well, and he knocked on the front door, and I had Mother go to it and said, oh, hello George, what's the matter? He said, well, I'm sorry, Ida, he said, but I'm on official business. And I said, oh, this is really not, because I'm trembling in that. Yes, he said, I'm afraid that I've been trying to apprehend somebody in the village for some time. He said, and I'm afraid because Lawrie was part of his team, and I recognise more from their back view, I've had to take this matter further. And this is the result. I'll read this out to you. This came in the county of Essex, Petty Session Division of Chelmsford, remember this was in 1950, so I was about 15, to Lawrence Bernard Tonbridge and Bernard Tonbridge, that's my father, of 6 Well Lane in the parish of Stock in the county of Essex. Information has this day been laid by Henry Richard Kemp of Chelmsford in the said county, Chief Inspector of Police, that you, Lawrence Bernard Tonbridge, being a child or young person under the age of 17, on the 15th of August, in the county of Essex aforesaid, did cause a certain vehicle, to wit a bicycle, to which the Road Transport Lighting Act of 1927 as amended applies, to be on a certain road within the meaning of that act called Mill Road, there situate during the hours of darkness, to wit at 10:50 p.m. I was out late, wasn't I? In contravention of the provision of that act, that is to say that such vehicle did not carry a lamp showing to the rear a red light, visible from a reasonable distance, kept properly trimmed, lighted and in efficient condition, and attached to the vehicle contrary to section 1 over. And it says, the information is further relayed by Henry Richard Kemp of that you, Bernard Tonbridge, parent of Lawrence Bernard Tonbridge, are the parent of Lawrence Bernard. You are therefore summoned, each of you, to appear before the juvenile court sitting at the Shire Hall, Chelmsford, in the said county on Tuesday the 22nd of September 1953 at the hour of 1:30 and 10 o'clock in the forenoon to answer the said information. Well, I thought I was going to be murdered. Eventually, a summons did come through and I didn't have to go to court. I was fined £1.10. And George Keeble was very apologetic, but he said there's one boy here that I wanted to catch, so I've got to take Lawrence to court as well. But you can imagine something like that for a bicycle, no real bicycle life. Well, I kept it because I thought it was execution, I was doomed.
Well, we had girl guides at Ramsden Bell House, and I used to cycle to Ramsden Bell House to the girl guides. And Miss Mulvey took it. She lived at Ramsden Heath, and it was really I really enjoyed it. I used to pick up Eileen Green at Broomwood, and we used to cycle down to Ramsden Bell House together. And it was during the war because we all went in a lorry, on the back of a lorry, to Kegs to sing with lots of other. It was a campfire too. To sing with lots of other guides from all over Essex, and Lady Baden-Powell came, and I remember the siren went and there was a raid overhead, and Lady Baden-Powell got such a powerful voice, and we all sang, all the guides kept singing while there was all this going on above us, all this puff of smoke and gunfire, but we just sang on Kegs playing fields. And I met up with a friend of mine that I met at school, and apparently she was there from Baddow, so I think it was all the guides from all over the place. It was a fantastic experience. And yes, so we did eventually have guides in the village because Father Tatham came to Stock in 1945 with the Guild of St Lucian, and each one of the people had a job to do. And Leslie Harvard, who was then Phyllis Baxter, she formed a group of guides in the Rectory Hall. We had to scrub out the Rectory Hall before we could use it. It was absolutely disgusting now. And anyway, we had lots of beetle drives because the church then had to be restored. When Father Tatham came, of course, it wasn't used. He said how clean it was. It was fantastic. It was still looked after. We had to go down to Lilystone Hall for services. Lord Perry let us have a chapel in Lilystone Hall until we could use the church again. But Father Tatham worked a whole plan out so that we raised money, and we had beetle drives and fetes and plays and all sorts of things. And they reached the target, which was amazing. I think it was about £20,000 or £25,000, which was a lot of money then. And the stained glass windows were replaced. And I remember the original ones. I remember one in particular that had been blown out. They were all the natural dyes of the flowers. They were absolutely beautiful colours. And the one I remember was of the Christ as Good Shepherd holding the lamb with lots of sheep round him, and the blues in that window were absolutely beautiful. They were lovely windows, but of course we lost all of them. But the modern ones, I think they were replaced very well. But we began by having heaters up in the chancel, and we used to have curtains to keep us warm, and we had services in that part of the church, and as it was repaired and restored, so you know we were able to use it in full again. But the organ was in the little chapel.
Where the old ale house was in, or the old leather bottle in Leather Bottle Hill, they used to have a skittle alley, and I've still got one of the big skittles at home. It's like a huge cheese. And I used to push this, I don't know how they're very heavy. I used to wheel these things down this polished floor.
The skittle alley was attached to the cottage there, and he divided it. He wanted somewhere where he could have a horse because he was the carrier then. And then when he stopped being the carrier and became the market gardener, he divided the skittle alley and the stables, and he had the cottage next to that was the wash house. Then we had the fruit room. Then we had the grain hopper room. Then we had a stable. Then we had where the chickens' nesting boxes were, and they had trapdoors into the orchard. He really did work hard, didn't he, Grandfather? And yes, I loved him very much because he used to walk with me and talk. He always said to me, from a very young age, don't ever buy leasehold. Don't ever buy leasehold. And it sticks with you, the things that he said.
Grandmother used to threaten me with eel pie if I I remember that.
And Grandfather used to say, childhood shows the man's morning shows the day. They had loads of problems.
Beautiful saying that, yeah.
Wonderful they were. And you never forget them. And Gran used to recite poems to us under the cherry trees. It was lovely. He used to lay under the cherry trees and she used to recite and used to get her to do it again. And she used to write, and I loved to write. I said, oh, I love that pen. She got an ink pen and she used to write out poems for me. And she said, when you're 7, and she got me a Conway Stewart pen, which was so lovely. Yes,
I was busy getting the birds off the trees.
Oh, no. Oh, yes. And Mr. Hapgood, that lived in the, recently lived in the plantation, he used to live in the Last Stop Road, and then he came up and my grandfather and grandmother moved into the cottage. Mr. Hapgood lived in the flat, and he let half of that to a family called Carney, and during the war this was. But then Mr. Hapgood had a poultry farm down on Dowell Road, below Cobblers, below their wood. That was a poultry farm, white Leghorn chickens, and I used to go up there trap nesting with his daughter Jean, and we used to I spent a lot of time up in the poultry farm. It was good. And then, of course, he went to fruit. He had a fruit orchard there, and he moved into the plantation. But he has died, I believe, now, and I'm wondering really what will happen to the plantation.
I think Mr. Lister, who owned the plantation, he lived in Axe Farm. And I remember he was so scared that it was going to be developed in some way that he let Mr. Hapgood have it for nothing. He didn't want to gave it to him. Very kind man, Mr. Lister. You know Axe Farm, I'm sure you do. And I remember when we moved to Stockton, there was a lot of development done. He had these wonderful leaded windows, genuine leaded windows, big ones, all different sizes. And I wanted some windows for the house, quite a few of them. They'd actually come from when they flooded the reservoir. So they came from down Siemens Lane. And Bill Salmons, who used to work for Mr. Lister, was saying, well, Mr. Lister's got some leaded windows in one of the barns there. If you found, I said, well, it's the original, all the nice solid oak frames. And he said, so I arranged to go and see him. I'm going to this wonderful study in Axe Farm. He said, oh, come, Lawrie. And I think Mr. Lister, I believe you're interested in some windows. And I said, yeah. So about 10 of them, I think. And I said, well, he said, well, what do you think? How much? And I said, no, I did it. You must have said, well, £6. And I said, what, each? He said, no, for all of them. I said, oh, yes. I paid £6 for all these lovely leather windows. And I think he got a tractor to bring them round to the house.
Well, when my father, there was a slump, and my father was an apprentice builder at that time, and all the building went, didn't it? I mean, he had to really do anything. But at the same time, as he was a builder, he went to Mr. Newton and he said he'd like to build a bungalow. And Mr. Newton said, go and peg out a piece wherever you like. That's what he said, and he did. And so he built a bungalow.
Opposite Michael, right?
Yes.
That showed the white lilies on there. What was it called?
White Gables.
No, it's
White Gables,
opposite Tetlows, actually.
Well, it's White Gables, isn't it?
Yes, it's called White
Gables.
White
Near
Gables.
where Michael was, yeah.
Oh, I don't know that.
Oh, you missed something.
But anyway, he pegged it out just where he wanted it and built. Bought it, and no red tape, no planning, in agricultural ground. And I used to play in the garden. I didn't know any children before I went to school, and I didn't go to school till 5½. But I used to play in my garden, and I used to watch Peter Greenwood over in his field flying a kite. He used to play alone as well. And actually it was Mr. Sartrus that was at the Greenwoods that bought the bungalow when we moved up to Lane. My mother didn't like living on the down the road, it was rather isolated. And we used to have people around, we used to have gypsies, we used to have the Indian carpet men, and we also had tramps. Now, the tramps were terrifying to look at. I mean, they had beards and long hair, they looked unkempt, and they had long trench coats, and they used to come to the door for tea or water, and it was not until a long time afterwards that I was told that they were disorientated soldiers from the First World War going from workhouse to workhouse, and I found that really upsetting because they were not looked after. And they were just lost people. They were shell-shocked, and nobody refused them. I mean, they knew, obviously, and gave them tea or water, and they went on their way. But they were very frightened because of their appearance.
Oh, I think we probably, nobody's asleep, that's a good sign. If you've got any questions, obviously we'd be pleased to try and answer. Or Barbara, but I won't.
Well, no, Lawrie will.
The police, mine was the first police house. What was before my house as a police house? There must have been something.
I don't remember one before that. I remember that house very well. Yeah. Was there one before that? Right?
Well, mine was only 1936.
That was the one with
That was Mr.
George Keeble.
Yes.
That's when he came off on his bicycle, so we knew where
He
he
was
lived.
certainly there in the 40s, Iris.
Well, the house was built in 36.
Yes, well, he was there
He
in the
would have been in
40s.
at the beginning.
No, I don't. I can't
He would probably have been the first policeman we had.
Was there a police house before mine? I mean, in the village.
No, he just lived there and with his wife, and they adopted 2 lovely little girls who used to come along to Sunday school. I used to pick them up, and then on the way we used to pick up other children. We had a huge Sunday school, really. And so I knew the Keebles quite well. I used to go in to see the Keebles.
Not well enough, I think.
He used to stand on the top corner so he could see everything.
I know, yeah.
He just did, and he was really sharp. But he was really fair, really nice.
Lovely to have a village policeman out here. It was lovely to see him coming around.
Yes.
Very comforting, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
And enjoyable. We had a Mr. Bosco in the village who came, he was Polish, wasn't he?
Yes.
He was a wonderful shoemaker. And we, something I can hear this off my chest now, but it's too late now, it's got 12 years have gone. And we used to leave him a merry dance. We used to knock on his fireworks through his letterbox, and we used to run up, he used to throw dustbin lids.
It's because he reacted, really.
Up past the bear, they come clattering up the street, and then about 10 minutes later, we see George's light coming around the corner. Look, we go.
And Joe Healy.
And special.
Oh yes, I've got a very lovely tale.
Oh,
because he was
oh,
special.
Yes,
and the Sayers lived in the Nook, and I married Ron. But the father Sayer, he led the Home Guard, and he'd been in the First World War. I mean, he'd been in the trenches at Ypres, and he was a real old soldier. He was super. And everyone had to be blacked out completely. You mustn't show any light. And apparently the Sayers had a little glimmer of light at the bottom of their, and I know it was Joe that went and knocked on the door. And Ron's father, Tom Sayer, said, "What, are they coming in submarines?" It was unbelievable. No, we had a lot of fun. And Victory night in the square was absolutely marvellous because they put straw bales down and they had dancing. People went, all the pubs were open and everybody went into them. It was a lovely night. It really was, and it was fine. And of course we had 2 hours later, we had harvest time, didn't we? For the harvest, we had the clocks so that you had light. It was light until about 10:30, 11. so that they could get the harvest in.
We have done some down.
We did, but you couldn't, yes, you couldn't show lights.
While I was trying to get to sleep. Awful man.
Keep that to yourself.
I remember coming home one day and we saw blood all down the road, my mother and I, from your house to ours. And you cut an apple.
Yes, yes,
We've been to Norwich, your mother's house, and you had this very sharp knife. I just cut it off, and I went right through my hand there.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, don't remind me.
I remember that.
I think the worst memory I have of the war was the plane that fell in the church field, and the sailors said, and I heard from different people, that it was coming down anyway, but somehow that pilot lifted it, because it was heading straight for our houses. He lifted it and crashed it in the fields, and it was in the church field behind you, wasn't it? And I heard the smell of the burning. And we always went to anything. We went to anywhere where a bomb had dropped or anything like this. And I went over there, and it's the worst thing I ever saw because they hadn't cleared it. And it was dreadful, dreadful. But I owe my life and return to him. And I think he was a Canadian. I wanted to ask, Tony Begg's not here tonight, is he? But I'd like to, because I think it was in Stock Press, and I think he was a Canadian.
It's commemorated in the Catholic Church.
Oh, I don't know.
They had a little ceremony.
I didn't know
And put a
that.
plaque, some years ago, put a plaque up. And my brother was playing cricket for Billericay against Stock on the common with Maurice Elliott
Yes.
and co. And when that plane came over, and they all dived into the hedges, and
Yes.
he was actually, the pilot was getting out. He was beginning to get
Yes.
out.
And he lifted
then
it.
he must have realised.
He lifted it. The Sayers said he
And
definitely
they saw
lifted it
that,
to crash.
you know, the young
Because he would have hit the
cricketers
houses.
and saw him go over.
I know. And I
We saw quite a lot, I mean, even I remember it. We saw quite a lot of activity because I think anything that was short of London was over Essex, and over here we had quite a few bombs. I mean,
we always,
Lancing Mill Road, there were big craters all the way down Mill Road.
and you knew the sound of a German plane, didn't you? Because it was so heavy. It was really heavy.
And I remember watching dogfights as well up in the
So
sky.
we watched the Battle of Britain from our back door. It was
We had a string of 6 unexploded bombs across the farm.
I know, we came down there once, Robert, because you had a very big crater in one of your fields. Yes, I remember. And the mill house was hit, and we all went round there, and apparently the floor, well, it was wrecked really, but the bedroom floor was like this. And I remember people saying, and her teeth still stayed in the blood. I mean, she's still down there on the bed. But it's amazing what things remember, isn't it? It's ridiculous.
Any more questions? Because we're taking up a lot of your time. Yes.
I think it sounds absolutely idyllic. I'm quite envious of you for been through it. It sounds wonderful. But a couple of things that you mentioned, I'm afraid I don't know what they are. Harmonium, accumulator, kitchener and blue bag.
The harmonium is like a little organ that she played with little stops and things.
You had a little with it was worked with pedals with your feet.
Yes,
Parents.
that's
So
right.
you had to pump it up.
Yes, and she played it and pulled all these stops out and things. Blue bags were what you put in with your washing to make it white. Yes. And what else did you say?
Accumulators.
Accumulators. Well, accumulators, they were
That's
filled.
what used to operate your old-fashioned ones.
Yes, you had to have one of
Before
those.
you had contained batteries, yeah, they were accumulated, which you had filled with this acid at the garage. They had
Yes.
these big glass things of containers, but you had to fill them with water
Yes,
with
it
this
was acid.
special acid, which then gave you a
Which burnt my
charge.
coat. It burnt you. If you got it on, you would burn it.
Yeah.
No glass, that's right.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, that shows how it
Today you have a more.
Yes, it does.
In those days it was a great big accumulator.
Yes, so they were heavy and they had to be carried out.
Yeah.
Because we had radio, didn't we? Yes.
Big heavy
And the other one,
That was it.
the Kitchener, is an old-fashioned kitchen range, black, and my grandmother used to blacken
like
it
ears.
with ovens at the side and the white and the hearth. And you had to get the fire going to get the kettle boiling. Then you had to cook in the ovens, get it out.
Every morning.
Yes.
And that was your warmth, there wasn't during the day, that was
Oh, it's
the warmth you got
lovely,
in the house.
lovely, and toast in front of the...
Yeah.
Yes, we could get it really hot.
Do you remember when the plantation was a nightclub?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yes, I do.
I do too.
Yes, I do, because it's got a ballroom, hasn't it?
I'm
It
saying
has
that.
got a
That's
ballroom.
right. Yes.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
when were the Lawrence Joneses at the plantation then?
Sorry?
When were the Lawrence Joneses at the plantation?
Thanks, Joe. I knew Major Moore.
Hapgood was there from, well, no.
Then it was the club.
Well, worked out, when did Mrs. Kieran get married? Because the Lawrence Joneses were there then.
Oh, well, was that when Mrs. Kieran was living at Apps Farm?
That farm.
Yes, so they would have met.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that must have been in the 30s.
Yeah.
Yes, it was. Yes.
And I know that the Dunstables that lived in Lush Hill, they were she was a really county person, was the only one that could take all the ladies or girls from the village to be dead, to be presented at court. Mrs. Dunstable, yes.
Which is Lush Hill?
On top of Birch Lane, what Pat Rayburn's house, that's Lush Hill. The Dunstables lived there. And yes, well, Margaret Kieran would have moved to Apps Farm when I was a baby, I presume. Because I only remember lying this.
Yeah. Well, Babby, you remember Babby?
Babby was very
Yes. I mean, when she'd had a few, she was very calm and she'd speak to her, when she had to ignore you.
Yeah.
No, I was thinking earlier,
Sad.
the great thing about my memory was everybody knew everybody in the village.
Yes.
And it was wonderful because you'd forever be stopping to talk to people, you never had anything done.
We talked all the time.
Yes, yeah.
We
And
didn't.
I don't know who it was, I remember Admiral Sir Vernon Hackett. Morning, Lawrence! Morning, Admiral! And he'd like to stop and have a chat. It's
Yes.
lovely, you know, people were, although they called me Lawrence, Mother only called me Lawrence when she was telling me off, so I was always thought I was getting into trouble.
But people used to put out, when they thinned out their spring onions, they used to put them at the gate and say, you know, you just helped yourself. And it was lovely. And when I think what you pay for spring onions now, you get about 6 for about, I don't know, you work it out at about 10p each. But they used to lay them out and you helped yourself. And there was bags of apples put outside Stock Lodge and the next one down on the green where Monica Watson lived. Apples were put out so that you helped yourself. They didn't ever, you know, you just had anything helped yourself.
I went to Stock's the old school for a while until I was 9, and then Mother didn't like Miss Redgrave's dog sitting by the big boiler, so she sent me off to Buxbury.
Well, my mother was determined to have Miss Corcoran, who was very strict, to teach Lawrie. And Miss Corcoran took the Roman Catholic children they had it attached to the Roman Catholic Church, their schoolroom. And she wanted him to go there because Miss Corcoran was there, and she was Roman Catholic. But because he was a Roman Catholic, he couldn't. So he went to Stock for a little while. But when my mother heard that Miss Corcoran was at Buxbury, she took him off. This is Perry Street, isn't it? Yes. So she went round there and she got him in. And she wanted him also not to be a country bumpkin, and she thought she got her eye on Walthamstow Technical School, which was a long way away, but she got him in. She didn't know that he was going to not be a country bumpkin. And, so he had to go by bus. I think it was so he was controlled.
We would like to thank you very much indeed for coming. So much.
I'll probably be arrested now when I go up.
And we'd like to thank you.